Hello, welcome to the Mediterranean Seminar podcast. Let's Talk Mediterranean, featuring myself, Brian Catlos, and my collaborator and co-director of the Mediterranean Seminar, Sharon Kinoshita. Mediterranean Seminar is a forum for interdisciplinary collaboration and the promotion of teaching and research centered on the Mediterranean. You can learn more at www.mediterraneanseminar.org. This is our podcast, and today's guest is Monica Green, and I'll turn it over to Sharon.
So for this installment of the Article of the Month, we're very pleased to welcome Monica Green, who's a longtime collaborator of the Mediterranean Seminar. So Monica is a historian who works on the intellectual and social history of medicine in pre-modern Europe and the history of global health. Currently an independent scholar, she's previously served as a faculty member at Duke and at Arizona State University. She's published on the history of women and gender in Europe, including a critical edition of the medieval compendium known as the Trotula, which is of great interest to medieval historians and historians of gender. And currently, she's researching the reception of Arabic medicine in 11th and 12th century Europe. So this represents a real cultural shift that altered the character of Western medicine. But she focuses it in a compelling way by concentrating on the Tunisian immigrant Constantinus Africanus. She's also been following recent developments in evolutionary genetics, and the article we'll hear about today really focuses on this. So she's used exemplary medieval diseases like leprosy as a framework for developing insights into the origin and dissemination patterns of the world's leading infectious diseases, and most notably plague, which she's going to talk to us about today.
Hi there, Monica. I guess I'll kick things off now that I've got the microphone back on. It's a great pleasure to have you. Let me say to start with that I hate this article because one of the favorite things I like teaching about the Black Death is the story of the Mongols firing the heads over the walls of Kaffa and infecting the poor Genoese. So that's no longer on the table. That's a disappointment. But clearly this is an article, The Four Black Deaths, that every medieval historian should read. So perhaps we can start by you giving us a little overview of the article and how you came to write it and so on.
This article comes out of my work as a teacher. I have always felt throughout my career that the hardest questions I have to wrestle with in my research are the questions that my students will ask me in class. So with the Trotula, and I spent 12 years working on the edition of the Trotula, I knew that however much work I did establishing the critical edition, looking at hundreds of manuscripts in the Latin and the vernacular, I knew that my students would ask the question, well, did a woman write it? With the plague story, I recognize that famous story that you just mentioned about the Mongols throwing bodies over the walls of Kaffa and starting the Black Death. It makes a great story in the classroom, but biologically, it doesn't make any sense at all, or it strains credulity. Let's put it that way. And the fact, and this has been known for decades, that the author of that story, and we only find it in one source, the author of that story was not at Kaffa. He was not an eyewitness to the events there. Was he just making it up entirely? Had he heard it from traveling merchants? That was another question. But the bigger issue is the map of the Black Death. And if you look at any textbook not simply on medieval history, but Western civ in general, on global history in general, you will find a map of the Black Death. And that map comes in one of two forms. The most common form actually shows the Black Death solely affecting Europe and maybe just the thinnest slice of the Southern Mediterranean. So it presents, and the narratives that usually get used to teach the Black Death will be almost entirely European sources. So the Black Death is treated as a European phenomenon that, in fact, it's assumed in most studies that it only had major demographic effects in Europe. If you, that's one of the maps. And the problem with that map is that if you look at the eastern edge of where the Black Death affected, it just stops at a certain point. It stops at basically kind of a line drawn north of the Caucasus, the area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And actually what's there, there's no geographic barrier. There's no massive mountain chain there that would have stopped commerce, that would have stopped human traffic, that would have stopped the spread of a disease. And so the map made no sense by itself. The other kind of map that you would find in textbooks is a map with these sweeping arrows moving across the entirety of Eurasia, suggesting that plague came from China. And that in the course of really about a decade, or even less than a decade in some narratives, it swept across the entirety of Eurasia and reached Europe, and then still did most of its damage just to Europe. And it's just like, well, if it's the same disease moving across all of these different landscapes, why isn't it causing comparable damage there? So anyway, that's where I started with that problem. And there were other issues as well on the table. For nearly 30 years of my career, I never taught a Black Death course. So even though I'm a specialist in medieval Europe, even though I'm a specialist in history of medicine, the one big thing I could have created a very special course from was the Black Death. And I chose not to teach it because I thought, I don't want to spend the entire semester giving students an answer of, I don't know. I don't know. Nobody knows. We're just making it up. So things like, what was the disease? That was the biggest question on the table for nearly 30 years, because there were people we call plague deniers who weren't denying that the Black Death happened, though there are some people who would like to say it wasn't as severe as some sources tell us. But they want to say it wasn't plague. So when I use the word plague, when scientists use the word plague, we mean specifically the disease that's caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This bacterium was discovered in 1894 by a researcher named Alexander Yersin, which is how we get the name Yersinia. And it was, within a few years, it was determined that Yersinia pestis causes plague in humans when fleas bite rodents that are infected with the disease. And then for various reasons, the rodents disappear, they die off, or the fleas just move on to other hosts, and they end up circulating in human populations. And so when the flea gets to a human, say, for example, if all the rats that it was used to feeding on have died off, it will seek out another mammal. And if it finds a human, it will take a bite. And as it's trying to suck blood out, it actually spits stuff back into the host. And that transfer is what puts the bacterium inside the human body, and then causes plague. So when we talk about plague, that's what we mean. But if there's a question on the table, as there was for really almost 30 years, of saying, well, it wasn't really plague, then that means that as historians, we can't make inferences about what is the disease interval. So the disease interval is the time between when you get infected, when you show symptoms, and when there is resolution. Either you die or you survive, you fight off the infection. Different diseases have different disease intervals. Different diseases have different modes of transmission. Different diseases have completely different life cycles. And so if you don't know what the disease is, then you can't use modern scientific information to make any inferences about what was happening in the past. And that was why I felt it was just kind of hopeless to try to do Black Death studies, because there was just too much uncertainty and no way to resolve these kinds of questions. But still, I'm a historian. I teach general history of medicine classes. I teach general medieval history classes. I have to talk about the Black Death at some point. And so I, like every other medievalist, had a little stock narrative that I would say. So I paid attention to Black Death research, kind of out of the corner of my eye. And around 2005, I started hearing these stories that, oh, these biologists have figured out a way to take the 19th century laboratory, the kind that Yersin was using to originally identify this bacterium, and that Koch was using to study tuberculosis, and that Hansen was using to study leprosy, to take the techniques of the modern laboratory science back into the past to diagnose diseases, not from verbal descriptions. I mean, I'm a historian, I can read Latin, medieval languages, etc. But they won't talk in terms of bacteria because they never saw bacteria. So medieval sources have an inherent limitation to how well they're going to help us answer these questions about diseases of the past. When you take modern science back into the past, and we're talking literally going into the graveyards of these mass graves that were dug to inter plague victims. When you take modern science into those graveyards, then you can retrieve the genetic fragments of the bacteria. You piece them back together. And then you can say, okay, this is this disease or it's that disease. You can rule out certain things and confirm others. And that's what happened. It was happening slowly, bit by bit, starting in 1998. I didn't even hear about this work until several years later. And what I saw was the biologists were disputing amongst themselves. They were saying, talking to each other and talking in their techno language, you haven't controlled for contamination. How do you know there wasn't already some Yersinia pestis in the lab where you ran these experiments? How do you know that you use proper protocols when extracting these materials from the ground or from the skeletons? So they were having this internal debate, and I was actually trained as a historian of science. And so I knew that when scientists themselves are disputing methods and interpretations, that it's best to just sit back and watch. And so that's what I did for the next several years. And in the meantime, though, for 3 consecutive years, I put in applications to the NIH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, saying, gee, wouldn't it be great to have a summer seminar where a bunch of medievalists sat down and read this work alongside the kinds of sources that we already use to talk about the history of disease in the Middle Ages, and just see what we think about this. It took 3 years of applications just to convince the NIH that this was a worthwhile project. But after 3 years, they finally did say yes. And in 2009, I ran the first NIH Summer Seminar in London devoted to this question of health and medicine in the Middle Ages. It was a 5-week seminar. 1 week was spent on leprosy, 1 week was spent on plague, and the other 3 weeks were spent on various other aspects of intellectual history, medical practice, art aspects of history, and so forth. And what we came out of London with that first year was a sense of, we're still not convinced. Yes, they're doing very interesting things, but they haven't fully proved it. They're contesting with each other. It still seems to be a mess. But what happened after that was that I kept my eye on this work, and I knew whose work to follow. I knew what studies, what labs to pay attention to. And the next year, there was just a major breakthrough, and then another, and then another. And by 2011, and it really is, it just kind of sends chills up my spine to remember this. 2011, they produced the complete genomic sequence of Yersinia pestis from the Black Death Cemetery in London.
Monica, let me break in right there. And I just want to let our audience know that the article of the month that we're now hearing the thrilling backstory of is called The 4 Black Deaths. And this article appeared just last year, very timely in our year of pandemic, in the American Historical Review, which is the official journal of the American Historical Association. And I just have to say that this is a hefty article, but nevertheless, I can't recall another case in which an article-length study kind of completely turned around what we all know about world history, and the way that your detective work and the way you masterfully piece together all of these studies that you have described following really reformulated not only what we know about the plague, but major periodizations or timing of world history. So I wonder if you could jump to the revolutionary part of your work, and why, as Brian said, all medievalists need to read this article.
Thank you. The reason I gave the backstory was simply to say that the genetics is not something that someone like me who wasn't trained in genetics can just jump into. And so I was reading it with the eye of a historian of science, and with the eye of a historian of medicine, who really just wanted it to make sense. That's really what I wanted to happen. I wanted the maps to make sense. I wanted the story to make sense. And it still didn't make sense when that first big genetics article came out with a whole genome sequence. And so what I spent the next several years doing was asking myself, so what? How does this change how we need to think as historians? And so that too was a gradual process. And I won't go through that whole story, but the essence of it is this, is what the genetics showed was that they were able to document the Black Death genome in Europe. But when you look at other genomes of Yersinia pestis, you get a sense that, well, the Europe story can't be the whole story, because there's Yersinia pestis in all these other places as well. And what was amazing was, and this was a study that came out in 2013, what was amazing was that they showed there was something that happened before the Black Death. They couldn't put a precise date on it because genetics is terrible with dates. But the before-after historical relationship is clear. Something big happened before the Black Death, and they appropriately called it the Big Bang. And what the Big Bang was is a dispersal of what had been kind of a unitary lineage of Yersinia pestis. It suddenly split. And it split, what I realized by taking the genetic information and actually putting it on a map, was realizing that it split into 4 different directions. And so you could look at where plague was in the 14th century to the extent that the paleogenetics work has been done. So this retrieval from the graveyards. And you can look at where modern plague is, because there's a very nice dictum in evolutionary genetics, which is anything alive today had ancestors. I mean, that sounds so simple that you think, well, duh, of course. But what that means is you can start looking for those ancestors. You can ask, well, where are those ancestors? And so what I saw on this map that I was forming in my head and kind of in sketches that I was making was, gee, this map that I'm reconstructing seems to have a lot of overlaps with the Mongol Empire. And as we all know, the Mongol Empire is the largest land empire in human history. Europe is on the edge, or no part of Europe was ever conquered by the Mongols, though a lot of people were living in fear that that might happen for quite some time. But the Mongol Empire was what unified this vast landscape. And again, the Big Bang happened before the Black Death. Well, how much more before the Black Death? And this is where I just had to learn a lot about how you can make chronological inferences from genetic information. But that is where we get the 4 Black Deaths, is what I realized was that something must have happened probably before the 14th century that pushed plague in all these different directions. And as we also know from studying the Mongols period of expansion stopped around 1260. There was still commerce, of course, going across the entire Mongol Empire, but the whole commerce story was as implausible to me as the throwing the bodies over the walls of Kaffa story. And that's because plague kills us as humans. I mean, basically, if we get plague bacteria in our bodies, we're dead in like 10 to 12 days. Sometimes we're dead in 2 to 3 days if we breathe it in instead of getting it through a flea bite. That's not a great recipe for long distance transfer from human to human to human to human across these, in some instances, really barren landscapes that make up Central Asia. So the idea that plague could have moved all the way across this huge landscape in the space of 10 or 12 years just didn't make sense. And so I just kept thinking, well, there should be some evidence though, plague kills all these people. We should, hear these stories of we should hear Boccaccian-like stories. Why don't we hear Boccaccian-like stories if in fact plague is happening all over the place? And basically, just learning a lot more about plague and its modus operandi, I realized that plague doesn't necessarily have to cause big, dramatic human outbreaks in every situation, that it can move and probably does move very quietly. And not through rodents. That was another thing that was just stretched credulity, was arguments that were saying essentially that rodents, either gerbils or rats, were just kind of marching across the landscape of Eurasia. Well, yes, we can say there are certain times, like an earthquake or something, that will pretty seriously disrupt resident rodent populations. But aside from maritime transport, rodents usually don't move around that much. And as you know, again, looking at the map of Central Eurasia, there's no maritime transport to be had in any meaningful way across Central Asia. So all of this was pushing me to think there must be something we're missing about the Mongols. There must be something we're missing about the Mongols. And then I found it. And this was because I was teaching. I was teaching a collection of sources about the Mongols, and I found in a text by Giovanni a reference to a plague outbreak at a siege at a fort called Lambasar in Iran. And I said, oh, that's amazing. How did plague get to this fort that is, in fact, almost halfway between Central Eurasia and Europe? And basically, what happened was just piece after piece after piece just kind of fell into my lap. But it fell into my lap, one, because I was looking, and two, I was willing to pay attention when the evidence came in front of me.
So let me ask a question. How important is it if you're, say, a historian of medieval Europe and people have been dying clearly, there's this massive mortality event. What does it tell us by knowing the precise vector or the precise cause of this? For years, people were arguing about whether it was Yersinia pesta or anthrax, or there were all kinds of other things. What does it give us now that we know the origin of the plague? And how does that, in what way does that force us to recast our history of that, of the 14th century, which was the mid 14th century, was this time of tremendous crisis in, particularly in the Abrahamic West, we might say.
What difference does it make? In some respects, and this is very important for us to remember, those of us who do cultural history, which I also do, which is that in some respects, it makes no difference at all. Because if the historical questions we're asking were about the perceptions of our historical actors, then those perceptions will remain the same. If they were saying that somebody could breathe on somebody and be dead the next day, or somebody could pick up a dead person's clothing and be dead the same night, that those were their perceptions. And I absolutely take very seriously that aspect of our work to reconstruct the world as they saw it. But there's another aspect that we do in most of our work, which is we do source criticism. And we compare one source to another. We are constantly assessing our sources for the plausibility and verisimilitude that they convey. And adding in what I call a new kind of material history enhances all the other work that we can do as historians. So very specifically, to know the disease means that, and this goes back to what I was saying before about disease intervals and so forth, is that you can postulate, well, what were the physical circumstances that they were actually presented with? And what I can say, if I know that it's plague, I can say that we're talking about a 7-day disease interval instead of a 21 to 30 day disease interval for smallpox, for example. That I can talk about the circumstances where it was likely to happen and the way in which it presents. So what are the symptoms that would be visible to people? With smallpox, the symptoms of smallpox, as we understand it in the modern world, the pustules and then the scarring afterward are completely distinctive. And that has different social ramifications for what people see and then how people react on the basis of what they've seen. Another factor, and this is why the genetic approach to studying plagues history is important. It's not simply a matter of saying this is plague and not some other disease. It's a matter of saying which strain of plague, what are the particular genetic characteristics of the plague that was found in the 14th century or the 15th century, 16th century, et cetera. And what you can say then is, and this was another kind of argument that was being made of those plague deniers. Some of them weren't saying it's not plague. Some of them were saying it must be a much more virulent strain of plague that is causing so much mortality. And what the genetic sequencing did was be able to say, no, the virulence genes on the genome seem to be pretty much the same as the organism that we find in the modern world. So there must be something different, not about the disease, but about the mode of its transmission or the susceptibility of populations. Maybe we need to look back at the Great Famine that hit Europe in the 13 teens and say, okay, this is a population that was systematically nutritionally weakened. And that's why this infectious disease. So the point is that when you have certain kinds of information, other questions ripple out from there. So yes, there are a lot of ways in which it makes a difference about being able to say that. It also means that we can compare across time and across space, looking at other scenarios where plague has been present. So for example, I live in Arizona. We have plague here in Arizona. It's only been here for the last 100 years or so because it was an import from around 1900 across the Pacific. But a lot of the science that's been done on plague has actually been done here in the United States. So can I take that modern science and apply it to the Middle Ages? Now I can. There's all kinds of ways in which, you have to be careful about the analogies that you're drawing. There's also a lot of ways in which we still don't know a lot about this disease and about its mechanisms. I was just reading last night, in fact, a new article on what happens to plague when it's inside the flea, because it actually spends like half of its life inside fleas, which are a different temperature, a whole different chemical environment, et cetera. So it's a very, very complicated organism. It's a very, very complicated disease. We don't know everything, but we know a whole lot more than we did even just 10 years ago.
Well, I have a very self-interested question because through my work on Marco Polo, I've become very interested in the Mongols. And the Mongols are certainly central, as you alluded to your new reading of the plague. So I wonder if you could focus on the Mongol, I guess we'll have to call it contribution to world history or to the plague history. And both what your focus on the Mongols does for the timeline of the plague, and then second of all, what you piece together about vectors of transmission because of the Mongols.
Wow, that's the hardest part of the work that I've done. I am a Europeanist, trained to do research in the European languages. I don't have any of the languages that are needed to do Mongol history. And
yet you provided a model of collaborative work with all of the scholars that you acknowledge in your essay, and how they helped you piece together this great puzzle.
Well, and I think it is very much a tentative puzzle. It's a puzzle of 10 million pieces, of which maybe I have 25. I think the next phase of work will be the Mongolists themselves going back through this material, through their material, and saying, what did we miss? Did we miss anything? And the biggest thing to remember about the Mongols for most of their period of reign is they're nomads. And plague is going to have a very different profile if you're a nomad and you can literally just pull up stakes and move your living quarters away from, you know, if there's a plague outbreak among the local rodents, you just pick up and move. I think we actually have evidence of Hulagu doing that in 1257, right before the major outbreak I chronicled in Baghdad.
Right. Hulagu is Kublai Khan's brother.
Yes, and Genghis Khan's grandson, one of many grandsons.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the last big push of the Mongols across Central Eurasia. So I think the Mongols, I think the Mongols didn't have a boccaccio, well, for a variety of reasons of just kind of different literary modes in different cultures, but they also didn't have a boccaccio because they didn't have the experience of great outbreaks until I think the 14th century. There might have been some in the context of military encounters in the 13th century. But again, it's the specialists who know the languages, who know the sources, who know the archaeology, who know the local topography. It will be their work to piece that story together. So
But
I think I have, it's one of those studies that's raised many, many more questions than answers. But in raising the questions, it says, gee, I think it's kind of a good idea if we looked, if we spent some time looking, if we reinterrogated our sense. And the other thing is, and this is very, very important for your readers your listeners to recognize, is the paleogenetics work that I refer to, that's retrieving the genomes from the grave sites. Up to now, that has all happened only in Europe, because people thought, well, that's the place to look, that's where the Black Death happened. It's only now that people have a sense of, well, maybe we should look at other grave sites too. And the technology of this work just keeps developing. They can do the sequencing runs. So most of this is computer work that they do. The computer power they have is like literally 1 million times faster than it was when I first started reading this science. So it's a field that is growing. It's a field where really I expect we'll get probably a major new study published almost every year.
Wow. Well, you know, it's interesting because you got me thinking actually just now. And, you know, of course, it seems that a sort of pandemic-like outbreak is only going to happen amongst dense populations, and nomadic populations are by definition dispersed. So, you know, even if Yersinia pestis was running wild among the Mongols or among the peoples of the Central Asian steppes, it probably wouldn't manifest itself necessarily as a catastrophic event just because there's not that kind of concentration of people around. But,
well, and this is why I always want to insist, plague is not a human disease. It's mostly going to circulate through rodents. And as I also said, I seriously doubt that the rodents by themselves are migrating. But, and this just blew me away when I made this connection, the Mongols, Hulagu is taking major grain supplies along with him on these long distance campaigns. And that all you need, literally all you need, is 1 or 2 infected rodents to jump into a big cart of grain. And that cart of grain becomes a plague bomb.
so in the end, it is the Mongols' fault, and that's really the important thing. But unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up very shortly. But let me ask you one more question, kind of pulling back from this. Your excellent revision of the Black Death, I think it suggests something about the Eurocentrism inherent in many of our disciplines. And I'm wondering what lessons, if any, this study you've done might give us as we examine other phenomenon, historical phenomenon, maybe aside from plague and disease. Are there any larger methodological perspectives we can take away from this that aren't specifically rooted in the study of medicine?
Yes, absolutely. And I should say that, as I said before, it was my teaching concerns that drove a lot of the energy that I carried into these questions. That was also true because over the last several years, I've also been developing a pre-1500 global history class. I mean, that literally, when I started off, I told myself I will not have earned the title global for this course unless I really can take in all the peoples of the earth. And what I realized in trying to do the Americas was I had to do a big switch over to archaeology, and just read a lot of archaeology and also better understand how archaeologists make historical arguments from their work. But the point is that most of us who are trained as historians who are trained as textual historians, we work with written documents, which are human products, and they have phenomenal capabilities for informing us. But not every society has produced written documents, and many societies that have produced written documents didn't have archival methods to preserve those documents. Material resources, however, are pretty widely found everywhere. And that gives us a fairly common playing field to compare different societies. And the thing about this work that I've done on the genetics, I mean, I'm taking work that scientists have done. I had no role in creating the data. But the thing is, it's material history too. It's just material history at the level of single cells rather than pottery or golden artifacts or things like that. So that's the biggest lesson that I've taken from that is create those interdisciplinary alliances. Give up our sense that we all have worked so hard to develop our skills in knowing the archives and of knowing these languages, of learning how to edit texts and translate them. But there's still only so much that we can do with those skills, that we need alliances.
We need alliances, but I think, this is made possible by your commitment to teaching. You've repeatedly brought up the role that the classroom played in this discovery.
Yeah.
And also your bottomless curiosity about things slightly outside your reach that you then, make your own. And this has been a model. So, in our venture of Mediterranean studies, we're often asked, well, but what about this area? Or didn't this happen elsewhere too? And so, we chose your magnificent piece as article of the month for Mediterranean studies because it tells such a compelling story about world history, for which the Mediterranean region is kind of the coda, the tail end of the story.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, it just graphically demonstrates the way that Mediterranean history cannot be severed artificially from the history of Eurasia or Africa or the rest of the old world. So, we really thank you. And then personally, I'm just thrilled the way that your article in this unforeseen way linked for me, my two recent areas of research, which is Marco Polo on the one hand and Boccaccio on the other hand.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
also, the article, and this really is in line with the Mediterranean Seminar, it really drives home the fact that, the idea that scholars that work in the humanities or the historical humanities are, toil alone in solitude with their texts is really, an image that's quite passé. Now, in order to really, we realize that in order to understand the world of the past, as much of the world around us, it's crucial to draw on different disciplines and methodologies and languages, of such a range that it's impossible for a single person to master them. As you said yourself, it's going to fall to someone else to do the Mongol side of the story, and presumably the South Asian side of the story, and all the other sides of the story, because it's just impossible for any one individual to manage that. And so, this is the reason why the Mediterranean Seminar exists, and why we're so, happy to have you as a member of our board and an ongoing collaborator. So with that, unfortunately, our time is up. It's been excellent talking to you, Monica, again. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks for your wonderful article, and we'll look forward to more of your work in the future. So
Thank you. Thank you both so very much.
Our pleasure.